So if anyone has questions during, I'll be able to let you know. But basically, it's just going to be, like we discussed, Luke, basically an opportunity for both of you to talk about Climate Justice Union, the work, why it's important, who should get involved, why, all those things.
Where are you calling from, Lee?
So I am in just north of Brisbane. So I'm in Redcliffe. How about you?
Whadjuk country in Perth, so kind of just south of the city.
Are you both in the same area?
Luke
We're
is
both on
more.
the same, yeah. We're both on the same Whadjuk country, but I'm about 30 k's to the southeast.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, I always start with acknowledgement of country of where I am, but also welcome guests to do that too. As when you'll hear me at the top of the hour. So right now we're starting to stream, and so people can start to see us and hear us as they're kind of like filing into the live stream. But yeah, at the top of the hour, then I'll do an intro of you both and the topic. I'll just say hello to everyone on chat. Give us a shout out if you're on chat. And I'm also live streaming onto Facebook and YouTube as well. Ah, Luke, that's our private chat. They can't see that.
Yeah.
Sorry. Anyway,
I
Luke
can't
says
see the
hello.
public chat.
No, you can't see the public chat right now. I think having that running at the same time might end up making things a bit too glitchy.
A bit too much for most posts.
Is there can you just share in the chat, in our chat, a link so we can put it into our Facebook group for our members?
Sure.
Is that okay? Luke, are you able to do that on your screen?
Yeah.
I'll just double check. So that should be my Facebook page if you're sharing on Facebook.
I think you probably put it into the public chat instead of the private one just then.
I'll put it in every chat.
Okay, cool.
There we go. So that's the one that you can share with people if they're on Facebook and want to watch live that way. I'm going live there now. Cool.
Hey, there's my face on Facebook.
There you go. Yeah, so if you start to, I better make sure that I've got that muted, but yes, there will be a lag, so don't get too obsessed with watching yourself on Facebook or you'll end up being like, oh, I'm on. I noticed the other day we were doing a bit of a session on StreamYard with a couple of other people who work at CimpaticoTV and one of the other hosts, Toby, who runs a channel on food and ag. And his lag time was around 15 seconds and mine was around a minute, I think, because obviously Australia takes a bit longer for things to get around.
Just sharing it into our Facebook group now.
Yes, please do. Oh yeah, can you lower your camera a little bit or maybe come closer to the camera, Jamie? I just noticed you're looking a bit shorter than us. There you go. That's good. Is that all right, Sarah? I can just see Sarah. Cool. Awesome. Nice. And hello to everyone in Facebook. We'll be getting started in a few minutes, chatting about Climate Justice Union WA, and hopefully maybe if you're in another state or area of the world, you want to start your own climate justice movement and union. Yesterday we had Mark Spencer on. He was talking about podcasting for the climate community. And so we'll be having that episode up on CimpaticoTV for people to watch back soon. I'm just going to make sure that I put some details into Facebook so people watching there know what they're watching. Here we go. And give us a shout out. Let us know where you are. The three of us have let each other know where we are, but obviously let us know where you are. And if you don't know, you should find out now whose land you're on as far as First Nations people, because that's important to know all the time, but it's NAIDOC week as well. So let us know who you are, where you're watching. Also, if you're watching on Facebook, YouTube, CimpaticoTV, you'll be able to chat and someone will get those questions, comments, emoji reactions to me throughout this as well. If you have any questions or things you want to add and things you want to ask during this, we're going to be talking about the Climate Justice Union WA. Here we go. Let me just add this so I don't end up writing what I'm saying. What's the weather like where you both are at the moment?
It's an interesting day today in that it's a bit rainy, but actually it's probably warmer than it's been for the rest of the week. Quite nice.
We're a bit overcast here actually, which is a nice reprieve. Hello everyone and welcome to Climate Australia. I'm your host Lee Constable and I'm going to start this episode as I always do by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I am talking to you. Today I'm broadcasting to you from Turrbal country here just north of Meanjin, otherwise known as Brisbane. I am on the coast, on the Redcliffe Peninsula, or what it's called today, which is on the kind of coastline near Kondamuka, and I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners here on Turrbal country, past and present, and also acknowledge the ongoing relationship that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and indeed Indigenous people wherever you are watching this, even if you're outside Australia, have with land, sea and sky, because we're talking about climate change and all of its implications, problems, solutions, etc. But we're particularly talking about climate justice, and we're talking about the Climate Justice Union. So I want to introduce you to our guest today. We've got Luke Skinner and we've also got Jamie Yallop-Farrant. Hello and welcome. Where are you joining us from?
Howdy. I'm joining from Armidale on Wajak Noongar Budja here in Western Australia, which is around about 30 k's southeast of Boorloo, which is also known as Perth. Jamie?
And yep, also on Wajak country, just kind of on the outskirts of Boorloo, in what is now known as Shenton Park. And Luke and I also want to pay our respects to the elders, the Wajak elders, past and present, and to all elders across this great continent.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for both of you for joining us. We're going to be introducing everyone to the Climate Justice Union of WA, why it started, where it started, what the problems are that you're hoping to collectively find some solutions to or advocate for solutions to. So let's start with how it all began. When did it all begin, actually? It's very recent, isn't it, Luke?
Yeah, I mean, it's officially we launched on the 26th of September in 2019. So we're a little bit over a year and a couple of months old. But the actual process of getting started with the Climate Justice Union and coming up with the idea and developing it, writing a constitution and recruiting a team probably started back in mid to late 2018.
And so, Jamie, how did you get involved with this? Did you already have this idea and then meet Luke, or you were already working together?
So Luke and I had already been working on various climate justice related kind of activities and events. So whether that was, rallies or policy work. And basically what happened was we got to the end of 2018 and a few of us, Sally Forrest, myself and Luke, got into a room and we were kind of like, we're kind of losing this. This is not working. And people kept coming to us asking us, what's the most strategic thing we could do? What do we need to put our energy into? And we were just really kind of struggling to see how we could actually get to the scale and the scope of what we needed to do. And so, yeah, we got together and we were like, we don't know what to do. We don't know what to do. And actually really quickly we were like, no, we know exactly what to do. We need to, we need to be drawing down emissions rather than putting them into the atmosphere. We need to be doing that as quick as possible. We need transition plans and they need to be resourced, and we need to be taking care of people in place. We know what to do. We just don't have the power and the resources to do it. And so that was where we then started actually looking at going, well, how would we do it? What would it look like? And it got really exciting. And we, started dreaming really big and saw all these opportunities and ways that we could kind of build on work that was already happening and kind of accelerate things that were already happening. And then we kind of had to have this conversation around how do we resource this, because a bunch of us either crowdfunded as I was or in our spare time and kind of sneaking it from other workplaces wasn't going to cut it. And so that's where the conversation of the Climate Justice Union came.
Yeah, and I think you're right. There are a lot of people from a lot of different walks of life asking that question, like, what do I do? What do I do? I know the problem. How do I solve it? So what sort of people were asking you that, and what sort of people were coming to you? Were they all, people working in coal mines, or were they all people just working in all industries, or what did you find were the kind of groups who were concerned?
We had a pretty broad section of society, really, I think. There were some, we've been working with coal miners, we've been working with people in the oil and gas sector. My own dad works in the oil sector and is actually going to be made redundant from his position because the refinery is shutting down. So there's a lot of people in those sectors, but then there's also a lot of interest, particularly in the health sector, in the mental health space, from young people, from Aboriginal people, from religious communities. I think it's very much a kind of whole of society, issue, and we have been intentionally engaging with all sorts of people across society even prior to the Climate Justice Union. So it was really coming from a lot of different sectors of society and people who care about environmental issues, farmers. Who else?
I think what was really interesting is it was people that were already engaged that had reached the limit of their strategy. It was people that were already organising events, or they were already doing everything they thought they could do, and they were like, this is not working, we need more. And then there was, kind of people that are working inside policy and inside government, both state and federally, that are like, well, how? Like, what does this look like? And I think people were beginning to see that climate was beyond energy policy. We needed to be having a conversation, as Luke mentioned, around health. We needed to be looking at infrastructure. We needed to be looking at water. And so people were very quickly kind of realizing that it's so big, they were then lost. So people were working on their existing things and realizing the limit to them, or they were kind of coming into it going, well, what and how and where do I go, and not kind of not being able to kind of focus on something that they thought was going to be useful within the scope of how big everything is.
Yeah, and so you've got all of these people impacted in different ways by something unifying, or that hopefully should be unifying, which is a climate crisis. How did you go about making sure that the Climate Justice Union would be able to advocate for all these different people at once?
I think part of it is that we don't think we can. So we're very different to most organisations that work in this space. So our theory of change is basically it's going to take everyone in every sphere of their life doing everything they can to sort this out, which is, you know, people are like, what's your one theory of change? What's your one thing? And we're just like, all of it. And so part of, you know, the Climate Justice Union is actually this real conversation around people doing their own things. How does that interconnect with other people doing their own things? And where's the interconnection between the silos? And how are we making sure that different people know about each other? And how do we ensure that people that are really kind of in leadership positions in water policy, for example, how are we ensuring that they're also integrating a climate analysis into that and a climate justice analysis, and that it's as big as it needs to be? And so I think our theory of change is it takes everyone, and it takes everything. And so the Climate Justice Union is kind of, it's not an umbrella, but it's a holding space. It's a holding conversation to kind of enable our members within their own spheres to do the things that they need to do. So we'll have members that are doing lobbying and advocacy work in different spaces. We'll have members that are doing actions around different kind of areas of interest. But the Climate Justice Union is kind of looking at, okay, where are the intersections? Who do we need to be talking to? How do we need to be bridging this conversation? So it's much more a facilitatory role than a very clear kind of we advocate on this. Doesn't mean we won't take positions, doesn't mean we won't do those things, but it's a much more facilitated kind of space.
And it's not all members who are going to, you're right, it's not always going to be members who are going to be doing this work as well. Like, we don't think the Climate Justice Union is the solution to all of the problems. What we recognise is that there needs to be an institution that has an eye on all of these spaces where change needs to happen, and that provides the resource and support to people who are in those spaces to make that stuff happen, because we can't rely on just waiting for, market mechanisms to sort things out, because that's what got us to where we are now, and will most likely just result in ever increasing inequality and leaving people who are on the margins of society to suffer. So, we want to make sure that all the people who are impacted by climate change, but also by the transition and by the changes in our society as that happens, that they have a voice in the space, that they are taking part in designing and implementing their own just transitions work, and in reducing the vulnerability of their communities to climate change impacts and all of that kind of thing. It's not always going to be Climate Justice Union members, but we as a union want to make sure that we have sight over the fact that these things are happening and that people are not being left behind, and that we can look at where that, if there is something that's not happening, we can try and do a strategic intervention in that kind of area.
Yeah, and Luke, when we first met and you started to talk me through the Climate Justice Union, you shared that great illustration that kind of had your creative collective vision. Could you talk everyone through what that kind of looks like? You might see that coming up on your screen now, or you can go to their website to check it out as well.
Yeah, I mean, this might need to be a combined effort between Jamie and I, because there's a lot into that. But essentially, and I haven't got it up on my screen in front of me, so I'll be thinking off the top of my head here. But essentially, at the bottom, we've got kind of the 5 pillars of what are the work that we do across everything. That they're kind of the foundations of our work. And off the top of my head, hopefully I get them right, we've got democracy, which is not just about people going out and voting, but it's also about people partaking in their civil responsibilities, whether that's being a union member, whether that's getting active around things, whether that's lobbying. It's about understanding that collective power and ownership over change is important, and that we can't let that go, because, as we said before, if it's just left to people with financial power to make the decisions, they're not going to be the ones that we need. And there's, in the environment space, sometimes people talking about ecofascism, and that's a reality that we don't want to happen. So there's democracy, there's
Can I just add
decolonisation.
I'll just add there to the democracy piece. We borrow from the disability advocacy term, nothing about us without us. And, often we think about democracy as kind of politics, but it's also about who gets to make decisions, who's involved in making those decisions, and how can we ensure that people that are impacted by decisions are involved actively in those decisions. So it's democracy all the way from our large-scale political spaces, but also right down to reclaiming democracy within our own lives, in our schools, in our institutions, in our communities. I might just kind of keep going with the foundations. So decolonisation, it's almost like it's our taproot. It's kind of the deep root that everything else comes from, and it's very much around healing country and healing people. So acknowledging that, we're on stolen lands, that there's colonialism and white supremacy are very much the causes of climate change. I think in the environmental movement, we often look at, fossil fuels are the cause of climate change, but actually, it's our worldview, it's how we think, it's how we operate, it's our extractivism in our worldview. And so very important for us is that decolonisation process, that actually looking at how do we shift our worldviews and how do we work and walk in the right way on these lands and in a way that has us work together. The foundations also include being grounded in truth, so like really acknowledging where we're at, not pretending that the climate science is anything else, not pretending that the realities we're facing are, we're not dealing with what's politically expedient or what's politically possible, we're actually dealing with where we're at. So decolonisation, grounded truth, a big bold movement, so really looking at there's space for anyone and everyone within this to actually create the kind of world and future we want. And that goes to our fifth foundation, which is telling the story of what we want. We're often very good at talking about what we don't want, but how do we tell stories that create interconnection between all of these different areas and actually move us through what's going to be incredibly complex and challenging times? So they're the foundations that go through everything. And the idea within the union, as you move up the image, is that we pool our resources, our people, our finances, our ideas to work across all the different sectors. And the little circles on those images are one of our attempts to kind of look at, different lenses, different ways of looking at how we organise already in our society. So often climate work is looking at emission sources, whereas we were looking at where are people already gathering? What people are already gathering around things like institutions and public service. People are already gathering around health and community. And so, if you look at it from that lens, what opportunities does that show up? How does that then frame the work that there is to do? And then it's working through all of those sectors to then achieve our three core aims. And so those aims, it's looking at planned and resourced. And it's really important that we talk about the resourcing. We know that there are so many incredible plans in the world of how we could do all of this, but they often just stay in really beautiful reports that, become kind of paperweights. And so we're looking at, how are we ensuring that we have the plans, but they're also resourced. And the three areas, as I mentioned at the beginning, are, transition. So planned and resourced transition plans, both for people, communities, and our ecosystems. Planned and resourced drawdown, so how are we actually taking carbon out of the atmosphere? And we kind of cut ourselves off at the West Australian border, so we're looking at all of WA and
that's
our
a big chunk.
Totally, and our
very big.
It's huge, but it's kind of what we're facing. It's what we need to be doing. So how are we actually drawing down across every area of society and every area of our kind of many nations, and then adaptation. But kind of we don't use the language of adaptation so much. We're more talking about how are we coping, how are we taking care of people and place. So how are we reducing vulnerability and increasing our preparedness for what is coming and for all the shocks and all of the changes, both from the transition that's happening, but also from the impacts that we're going to be seeing more and more of.
Yeah, so I just wanted to take... Oh, sorry, Luke.
No, you're right. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I'd just like to take a moment, though, to maybe if we can zoom down into a couple of those spots, because obviously climate justice looks very different whether you're someone working in hospitality or tourism or mining, or whether you're someone who's working in conservation. So if you could just like maybe pick a couple of examples to give people a picture, whether they're, no matter where they're watching and what kind of area they're in, for how that might look for someone.
Yeah, well, so first and foremost on there, I think it's the first one that you see in the top left-hand corner is geography. So we're actually looking at kind of where people live as well, you know, because that's a really key important part of this. You see when a climate disaster happens, like the fires that happened earlier in the eastern states, actually there were some in WA as well, they just don't get talked about as much, that's when those communities become exceedingly dependent upon themselves. And when those communities having the capacity to cope and survive on their own and to be resilient and, you know, to be able to turn their electricity back on, so they don't have all of the food supplies at the hospitality venues go off. They don't have the power go off for their local aged care facilities and disability care facilities, for example. So at a local level, and also then you've got communities that are, for example, in Western Australia, you've got Collie, that is a coal community that needs its own specific, you know, transition plan that looks after those workers and gives them jobs that are equivalent in the skills and, you know, similar kind of secure quality jobs. But that's very different from what you might have for a remote Aboriginal community or for a community that's, you know, on the fringes of a city where it gets really hot and there's really low quality housing. And that again is very different from, you know, what you're experiencing as in a transition if you're a farmer, for example, right?
Yeah, so Jamie, maybe you can...
a few different sectors. I was just going to say a few different sectors and spaces, and Jamie will pick up
on the community sector there.
Yeah, so an example of a piece of work that's been done that we're involved in, it's been led by an academic who's also one of our founding members, Naomi Godden, down in Bunbury ECU within the Budja Justice, Budja being the Noongar word here for land and country. Centre is a piece of work around a climate justice toolkit for social services and community sector. And so we know that people that are already vulnerable in our society, people that are already marginalised, people that are already experiencing kind of complexity in their life are most likely to be impacted first, harshest, and in a more ongoing way when it comes to climate. And yet we haven't done a lot of work around that intersection. And our social service organisations, due to, you know, a whole host of kind of neoliberal capital kind of interventions, are, you know, underfunded, kind of always, you know, having to focus on very specific projects. And so to ask them to then kind of engage with climate is a really hard piece, because there's a lot of work to kind of work through how do they do that, what is their role. And so whilst there's been a lot of work in that sector around disaster resilience and how do those services and organisations prepare for emergencies, because they're often on the front line of dealing with that, the general advocacy around climate justice and integrating that into their existing work has not happened. And so what Naomi and her team are doing, in partnership with a bunch of different community and social service organisations and ourselves, is looking at what's a toolkit? How can we actually provide people with the resources so that they don't have to start from scratch, so that they actually, as an organisation, can literally go to a website. Yesterday we were on a Zoom call, we were looking through the kind of the prototype of the website. It's actually looking at this website and going, okay, so if I'm in finance within an organisation, click on a button here, what are the things within finance and procurement that fit within a community sector process? What are the things that we can do individually within our teams? What are the things we can do as an organisation? And what are the systemic advocacy and lobbying pushes that we can be doing in partnership with others across the sector? And so there's this very real, incredible piece of work that's been done that is actually then really exciting. It's looking at the intersections of particular groups of people and how it may affect them. You know, disability, for example, there's particular conversations that need to happen around climate justice and disability. So really kind of breaking it down into those areas, but then actually having those resources available so that organisations can kind of go, okay, right, I know I have to do something, but I don't have, we don't have the capacity to do the work to work out all of the things. oh, okay, here's a framework, here's a guideline, we can build on this. And also what it's doing is it's challenging the climate movement. So when I was looking at the tools, I'm like, so a bunch of these tools that we've been developing for people aren't actually translatable into this space. So it also means we can go back into the climate movement and go, I know you do this kind of like, here's your 5 top things you need to do, but they're actually really based on privilege, neoliberalism, and home ownership. So can you develop some more top 5 things so we can link to you? So that's kind of an example of how we're working and how it kind of goes into one particular sector.
Yeah, I just want to take an opportunity to say hello to some people who've given us a shout out. We are on Facebook, CimpaticoTV at the moment. Carly obviously earlier said she's on Ngunnawal Ngambri land, but we've also got Caleb, who says he's in Cobargo, 2 areas very impacted by bushfire. And we've got someone called Grumpy Old Dave. G'day, Grumpy Old Dave. I'm hanging here in Turrbal Yagara land. Hi, you're not too far from me, Dave. So we talk about, obviously all those different sectors as workplaces, but also all those different people, regardless of whether they're a worker or an individual accessing the services of various institutions and businesses, or accessing nature and land and being a part of it that way. One of the things that you touched on was, for instance, what it means for disability community. And I think, Luke, you mentioned bushfires in WA obviously being a big problem. And I know I've just seen on the weather this morning that, there's all this bushfire risk for WA all over again. Is climate justice in that kind of space, even things like thinking about evacuation plans for people with disabilities?
Yeah.
Or is that the sort of thing that could end up being part of this work?
Absolutely. So, that's the kind of thing that is a really key part, right? Like, from the perspective of justice, anyone who's going to be left vulnerable as a result of climate impacts, we need to do what we can to reduce that vulnerability. And an evacuation plan's a good example, but also just making sure that there are, enough workers in the community to be able to help, like, who live in that local community, doing that kind of disability and aged care support role, so that when the roads get cut off, there's still someone in that community, so there's a lot of different ways that can be approached. And actually those things can be considered from an occupational health and safety lens as well. So some of the way we work is about getting other organizations that are already operating in a space and kind of jamming, climate stuff into that space and being like, well, this is impacting you. For this example, this is impacting your workers and also the clients of your workers. That then has mental health impacts on the workers as well, and on everyone in the community, the families of the people that are being looked after. So that is a perfect example of the kind of work that we want to encourage to happen. And it's not necessarily that Climate Justice Union is going to be the one going out there and creating these plans, right? But we want to go, all right, who has kind of right role to be able to push for that kind of thing. And so, a union that covered disability support workers, for example, would be one example. And then also, someone like People with a Disability Australia or a disability advocacy group might be a good group to work with in that space. And then obviously there's also local, federal, state governments and their responsibility to their local communities. So there's advocacy work to be done around that. And then there's also, regional community groups themselves understand what the risks in their communities are. So there's a whole lot of different groups that we would probably want to work with. And then there's also, Climate Justice Union members who also have some of those intersectionalities themselves that we draw on the experiences of.
Yeah, and you mentioned intersectionalities. Like, next I want to talk about traditional landowners, First Nations people, Indigenous people across WA, which obviously includes many nations within WA. Also recognising that people in the disability community are Aboriginal people as well. What does it look like in that sort of space? Is it part of your work then just reminding different people as they're doing these other roles, hey, are you including the rights and the perspectives and the connection with country that First Nations people have on that land or in that space? Is that part of what that is?
It's a combination of things. Some of it is actually working alongside people that are already working in those spaces. So working with Noongar people or other Aboriginal people that are, kind of doing their own work. There's an incredible amount of work that mob are doing across all the nations to take care of people and country, and often they know what needs to be done. It's actually advocacy around ensuring that Aboriginal controlled organisations get the funding they need to do the work that they need to do, right? So part of it is that. And part of it is ensuring that when policies are being developed, the right people are in the room and creating those bridges, and even simple things like I was asked to MC an event, and I'm like, who's on your panel? And it's a panel of, funnily enough, all white people talking about country, and I was just like, no, I will not be emceeing your panel. You need to go away and you need to deal with that, and then you need to come back to me, and then we'll have a conversation. So sometimes it's kind of refusing to participate in things until the right people are in that conversation. Sometimes it's making sure that we're going into spaces and we're taking people with us where we've got access. And sometimes it's also just really demanding that the access is provided and the support is provided. And that can be structural. That can be paying people honorariums. It can be providing people with transport so that they can get to an event. So there's a whole range of ways that can look like. But I think, given it's NAIDOC week, I think if anybody went to any NAIDOC events led in the local communities, they would have seen that there's so much climate justice work already being done across these spaces. It's just not called that. And so where's our work, and what's our role in amplifying that, supporting that, getting out of the way when we need to, and how do we ensure, and then the other piece is, how do we ensure that our climate processes and our climate justice processes are accessible? So, we've got a long way to go about that, but making sure there's signing, making sure there's kind of written transcripts of work, making sure that we're working in venues that are accessible to different people and our online processes are accessible. So, also ensuring that people can participate if they want to participate.
Yeah, and in addition to that, sorry to cut you off again, Lee, in slight addition to that is making sure that, there's a lot of conversation about the massive renewables boom and how great this is for the economy and everything like that. But actually what a lot of it currently says is we're just going to go put a shitload of infrastructure on top of Aboriginal lands and extract value, and there's going to be nothing in it for them. Twiggy Forrest is proposing 220 something gigawatts of renewable energy around the world, and his history of the way they have dealt with Aboriginal people here does not suggest that is going to be an equitable and fair process. So for us, it's also about making sure this process, and particularly where it's being advocated for by climate activists, is not one that is going to make things worse. And unfortunately, in the climate space, there is a little bit too much enthusiasm for massive energy products without the groundwork that needs to be done to make sure that they're supported by the community, that any profit comes back to the community, and that it's not just another extractive process that continues the colonisation and damage that we've done for hundreds of years now.
Yeah, so on the topic of decolonisation, and obviously that's a big part of your work, while I'm not based in WA, I am still benefiting from colonisation and perpetuating it whether I like it or not. And hopefully I will be able to recognise and work against that. If you were to see Climate Australia, this channel, for instance, and decolonisation in this space, and this is definitely not the only conversation we're going to be having about climate and Australia and what that means and decolonisation, but what sort of advice would you give someone like me for decolonising this space and making sure that climate justice is recognised and is part of this channel as we're growing an audience and growing, who we're inviting on, for instance, is an obvious one. But beyond, having Indigenous voices on here, what more can happen?
I think it's, obviously it's having more Indigenous voices, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voices here, but also kind of asking presenters to prepare to explore it, right? So for us as the Climate Justice Union, we're in the process of creating like memorandums of understandings of how we work with other organizations, of what are our baselines. And so looking at like our baseline is that, you know, there has to be a conversation around decolonization, which for some organizations and some groups is kind of like they've never done that. They've never had that. So if when you're preparing to speak to presenters, you're like, I'm going to ask you about these questions and these conversations. What it's actually doing is kind of going, oh, this is a thing I need to deal with. This is something that I have to have a conversation with. Yeah. And I think it's also understanding that climate justice from a First Nations perspective, as I've understood and been taught, it's about deaths in custody. It's about land rights. It's about health impacts. So really kind of watching and engaging and looking and actually kind of profiling those conversations within this space. So it not necessarily always being about climate, but it being about those broader justice issues and kind of inviting that into this space and helping kind of educate our entire movement around those conversations. And I think also, you know, the accessibility stuff. So a lot of crew across the country, they speak different languages. So maybe it's about actually asking if this could be translated. Maybe it's actually about having episodes done in language, whether it's Noongar down here or whether it's, you know, the kind of first languages of some of our other communities and mobs, and actually dealing with this is going to be in language and we'll provide you with a translated transcript.
Yeah.
You know,
if you can't deal with that, then how do you think everyone else feels?
Exactly. So it's kind of really continuing to push those boundaries and push those conversations. And I think really arguing for, there's a bit of a conversation that this is an add-on, like it's a good thing to have. It would be nice to do this, but actually we just need to get emissions down, which is how come we end up applauding the likes of Twiggy Forrest, and we end up applauding billionaires kind of coming up with techno
any progress is progress for everyone when it's
totally. And so I think it's also kind of really critiquing that and actually saying that this is central. You know, this is not a optional extra. How do we actually think we're going to regenerate and restore this country or these countries without the knowledge of those that have been here for the longest of times? But also, a lot of the elders I'm working with, they're not interested in coming and talking anymore. They're done. Yeah. They're like, I'm not coming to your event. I don't want to be on your TED Talk. I don't want to be in your conversations because I'm tired of talk fests. So that we also need to be taking up that challenge and actually delivering things and being different. So I think they're kind of my kind of top lines, not only for yourself, but for anyone listening, you know, like there's this, we actually need to walk and demonstrate that we're genuine in this and be redistributing our access and power.
I think that's a really important point to bring up as well, recognising our audience as well. We've got Mark Spencer saying hello, and he's part of he created Climactic Collective, the podcast and the network. We've got...
He's also a CJU member.
There you go. Good on him. Hey, Mark. Well done. We've got Mike, who is one of our hosts of another channel all about impact media, who's also obviously someone in media himself. So it's really cool to have these sorts of discussions as well, because when you were talking about language and accessibility to these different Aboriginal communities, I also was thinking, but like, am I making content that actually is useful or interesting to them? And the answer is not always, and mostly probably not. And I suppose, I'd have to think, if I'm going to do that, I should make sure that the information that is being shared is things that they're actually going to find useful. So it's not just me, you know.
You need to be led by the people that you're trying to appeal to, right? Ask them what content they want and then help them deliver that content. The other piece is solidarity, right? It's making sure that when there is a key moment, and there are lots of them, that your voice is one of the voices that is seen, you know, to be showing the support that you need to do, you know, that you take your live stream down where there's a rally that's not about climate, but is about justice, and recognizing, you know, that there are First Nations media that is already out there that is talking about this, you know, providing platforms to them, working with them, you know, and recognizing that, as we were saying before, it's the people who have the most vulnerabilities in our society that are most impacted. And so when we're talking about anything where there's going to be impacts, and this goes whether it's Aboriginal people, coal miners, you know, or any other group of people, workers, that the people who are impacted are the people that you're consulting with, not just the experts who are, you know, giving lectures and writing from an office somewhere.
Yeah. And Jamie says not only vulnerability. Would you like to expand on that?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think also we often talk about whether we're talking about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people or we're talking about people with disability, you know, we talk about vulnerability and yes, there is absolutely that. But I think one of the other things to recognise is actually that's where the solutions are, right? Like if we could have solved this with existing white supremacy and capitalism, we'd have kind of dealt with it by now. So part of it is really dealing with that actually the solutions come from those with lived experience. Again, this is not an added extra. This is actually something that is core to our work. We do not get the solutions. We do not address the climate crisis unless these conversations and the people that are have these solutions are providing them. And so I think it's really, you know, we talk about vulnerability, but in the COVID space, for example, the First Nations response to COVID was one of the best in the world. So their closing down of communities, the Aboriginal-led responses in the health sector, the collaboration that happened across the nations, and the way in which they collectively lobbied into government to get the solutions that they knew they needed for their people, both in urban settings and also remote settings, actually meant that their rates of COVID were far lower than any First Nation, any other people within Australia, and also, you know, so far there have been no deaths within a First Nations community across this country. Now, that's not how that normally goes, right? Health disparities are often the total opposite way. And so actually when people are like, you know, like, how do we deal with these things? It's like, actually just go and have a look at what is already being done by these organizations on a smell of an oily rag, like totally with, you know, shoestring, almost no resources. Imagine if we actually resourced these organizations properly and if we actually ensure we got ourselves out of the way. What would that look like and how does that work? So I think it's acknowledging, and same in disability, you know, like some of our members are the most extraordinary, like their skills are extraordinary, right? So we've got people with disabilities that are just like, here, these are the resources. This is where you need to go to. This is how you manage this. And I'm like, okay, slow down, hang on, I can't keep up. So I think it's also that kind of paternalism that we often have. And actually
just
kind of getting
like, what's
that
the
out the way.
solution, as if there is none. And often the people who have the resources make assumptions based on what their needs are, or would be. In the face of COVID, for instance, you know, we see that our politicians are mostly, well, overwhelmingly white, overwhelmingly economically privileged, overwhelmingly educated in private schools, in city settings and things like that. So yeah, it makes sense that people aren't just being vulnerable, they're actually advocating for themselves, they're advocating for their peers. Yeah, that's an awesome note for us to unfortunately have to end on, because I've really been enjoying this chat so much. Thank you both for coming here, for sharing what the Climate Justice Union is all about. Just going to give you both an opportunity to give a plug, and let us know how people can get involved, and then we're gonna roll some credits, but we can also chill out if there's anyone. I'll be chilling out for a little while if there's anyone online with questions, and you're both welcome to do that too as well.
Well, I mean, people who want to join can join via going to our website, www.climatejusticeunion.org. There's a join form on there. We have memberships that are for people with all financial circumstances. So the standard membership's around $10 a week. That goes to paying wages and costs and resourcing and all of those things we've talked about around being accessible and, you know, being able to pay honorariums to Aboriginal people that we're consulting with and all of those kinds of things. But then we also have fees for higher incomes and lower incomes, and there's a solidarity fee for people who don't have an income. It's only $1 a year. So we're really trying to make it as accessible as possible. You know, your financial circumstance shouldn't prevent you from being a part of a justice organisation. And we really do need people to join up who can afford to, and also people who are just, you know, keen. We want people to get involved. We want to be able to support you to do the work that you want to do.
And then also, if you're involved in an organisation and you want to kind of have a conversation, if you're in WA, then obviously, you know, get in touch with us. But even if you're outside of WA and you want to have a conversation about any of the things we've been talking about, you can get Luke and myself on our admin email. So it's admin@climatejusticeunion.org. And, you know, we can follow up and have conversations. So if that's kind of collaboration, if that's wanting to connect in with something that we've said, so yeah, feel free to follow up and have those conversations, and yeah, as many people can join. And you don't have to be in Western Australia to join. Some of our most active members actually are on the East Coast, which is kind of really fun because they're like, oh, we haven't got one yet, so we'll come and kind of work with you guys, and then through learning through that, they're then taking that into their work and their practices. But absolutely, if you're in WA, then come and join us.
Awesome. Thank you both so much. And that's the end of this part of the stream, but we'll be back in just a moment for just chatting. So if you're hanging out on Facebook or on CimpaticoTV, feel free to stick around and keep chatting to us. Thanks so much. All right, here we are. We're back again. And obviously, if either or both of you need to leave, because I know you're very busy people, you're welcome to say goodbye and log off at any time. I just know that I love a chat, and so and so I wanted to give you the option to hang out if you're free. So yeah, thanks so much for joining me. We've had some great things being said. Lisa said, "Well said, Luke," at about 12:15, but I forgot, I wasn't looking at it. Whatever you said at 15:15, the hour was awesome, according to Lisa.
Thanks,
yeah,
Lisa.
And Mark Spencer also said, here, wonderful plans ending up as paperweights. Also keen to see that stopping, which is good. But yeah, I'm really keen to stay a part of seeing what your journey's like. Is there anything you would recommend that we should be more aware of as I'm thinking about topics coming up, guests coming up, organisations coming up, things that I need to be following more closely than I've been following even without guests and organisations, that I can help get the word out on? Is there anything like that you think you'd like to highlight?
I think we're going to see over the next 6 months, there's going to be kind of a big shift in what is publicly said in the union movement. You know, over the last kind of year or two, it's been very much dominated by a few of the fossil fuel unions, but there's a lot of other unions that are starting to get more vocal in the space. You know, some of the unions, like we were saying before, that represent disability support workers, for example, talking about this as an issue that affects all of the union members, and about the just transition and about occupational health and safety. So it'd be worth, you know, keeping an eye on that space, because we don't want the misunderstanding that's been going on between the union and environment sector that's been putting, you know, jobs against the environment kind of framing and causing trouble in our politics and in our, you know, what should be allied movements. We don't want that to continue, and this is one of the kind of spaces in which people are working to try and break that down.
And I think also there's the community sector. So kind of, you know, looking to what's happening in that space and how that can be amplified. And I think also there's a world of work around mental health to be keeping an eye on. So one of the things I suppose we didn't mention earlier was the increasing understanding of the interconnections between mental health and climate, both what's being termed eco-anxiety or climate grief, but also that experience of kind of, as people come to understand the complexity of what they're dealing with and they see the mismatch in how society is dealing with it, people are dealing with, you know, people are kind of experiencing that and trying to negotiate and work through. There's how you parent in this space, how you actually, I have a 5-year-old daughter, and how do I have conversations with her around these injustices in a way that she grows up inspired to be alive and, be in the world, right? Like, how does that work? Like, what are those conversations? But also the mental health implications and wellbeing implications around the amount of work there is to do, and the fact that we're not resourcing the communities to do this work. So much of the burden for the solutions that we were talking about fall on people in their spare time, in their extra hours, or people that are already doing, we know that when COVID happened, for example, women who were already dealing with a tremendous amount of emotional labor and burden in their lives got more, right? So, like, how do we ensure that we're actually providing the resources for those people to do the work that there is to do, and actually relieving them of other things if need be, and bringing more people into this space, So I think mental health, I think well-being, but not from a, let's all just meditate, but like well-being from a genuine solidarity. This is an ultra marathon. This has to be all of us. It's part of why we're union. It's like, this has to be all of us for the long term. It includes the stories and the creative arts. It includes the how we tell stories of who we are and what our role is as humans at this time. One of the creation stories here on the Southwest in Noongar country is the Carers of Everything story, and it's this conversation around humans, our role. We were chosen to care for everything. Our role is to be carers. That's not the story that's told in our general society. So, how are our artists, how are our musicians, how are our storytellers, our media people telling stories that hold us, that are safe for us to meet the challenge that we're in? So I think, there's some of my kind of things to be looking for. And I suppose finally as well, the post-traumatic stress response from last year's fires. So I don't think we have any idea of what that has done to our society. And I think there was so much crisis in our community, and then COVID came, so it did not get responded to. It got kind of pushed down, and then there was another thing, and then that got pushed down, and then there's another thing. And I know for myself, we didn't have fires kind of close to where I live. I was watching them, but I wasn't smelling the smoke every day. I wasn't having to run for my life. But the first very, very hot day this year that we had, I had a trauma response to it. And I was like, wow, that's interesting, right? Like, I had enough kind of understanding of what was happening to be able to watch that and see that. What's going to happen over this summer? And I don't know the different names of the seasons, but here it's over Birak and Bunuru. Like, what happens when kids go to school in a heat wave and they're concerned, but they may not have the language to talk about that? They may not know what it is that's causing that anxiety, and then all of those things.
Yeah, and I can definitely relate somewhat to that kind of childhood trauma and anxiety around things outside your control, because growing up, in the millennium drought as a farm kid, it's not till now as an adult that I'm really starting to realize the impact that had. I knew it had an impact then, but I think I thought it was quite normal to be that anxious about when it was going to rain, and be that anxious about your parents' finances, and be that anxious about, fire and drought and all those different things. But it's not until later that you kind of look back and go, wow, that's not normal, to worry about that. And it's cool to hear as well, given that we've had this ongoing pandemic, and that's got economic consequences for people losing jobs, people who already were homeless or without money or in need in so many ways, now put in worse positions. I know Carly said, to your comments about non-homeowners earlier, yes, fantastic comment on that. And as a non-homeowner, I agree. it's great to hear that you're kind of modeling this thing where people don't have to have money to be part of a union. I know that the unemployment union got a lot more members this year for the unemployed, and it seems like often the people who have the most resources have the most ability to advocate for getting more resources. So yeah, it's cool to see this model of the way that you can do things. Is this something that's becoming more commonly talked about amongst people in the union movements?
Yeah, actually, it really is. So obviously, we're not an industrial union. We don't cover people in their workplaces. Similarly, though, industrial unions and their members are people in the community as well. And so more and more commonly, we're seeing industrial unions have like community memberships that are either low or no cost to enable people who are not necessarily covered by that union. Maybe they're a partner or a child or something of someone who is part of that union, or they just live in a community where that union has a big presence. You know, for example, if there's a coal community and it's a coal workers union, etc., then they're able to join those things and join in the kind of campaigns that unions have. And I think that's going to be an increasingly common thing as unions engage around climate campaigning. So yeah, it is definitely a thing. And also unions have almost always actually had unemployed memberships, for example. You know, if you're a member of a union and you become unemployed, quite often you'll stay as an unemployed member. They don't kick you out. They just stop taking fees from you, and you maybe don't get access to some of the things that would cost the union resources. But it is from a outside of the union perspective, in a more community kind of organizing sense, and in the environment space and in other membership-based organizations in general, it's not as common to have, you know, a relatively close to free membership. And that's just because for us, it's more important that the people who want to do the work are able to be supported to do the work than anything else, you know, and that's the reality of it.
And I think just adding to that, I think, again, it comes down to that worldview of, you know, how do you think change is going to happen? And so there's this constant conversation in a lot of our spaces, you know, how do we look more like the community out there, you know, like we're very white, we're very middle class, we're very urban, how do we look like other people? Or, you know, kind of, you know, how do we go reach those hard to reach people? But actually part of it is because we're operating in these kind of silos that are not connecting, and we're not where we need to be. And I think, and so, you know, I've seen and at least the conversation is being asked, like at least the questions are being asked. But I think people are not realizing that actually sometimes it takes paying people. So we at the CJU kind of have an agreement that, you know, when it comes to developing policy or ideas or processes for the Climate Justice Union, members and people with lived experience of whatever it is we're talking about get offered an honorarium. So we're not extracting. We're actually like going, no, we want to pay you for your time. We want to ensure that there's a reciprocity in that. It's not we're purchasing it from you. It's an acknowledgement of the time and the space and the generosity in which you're giving this. And some people take that and some people don't. But I think it's like if we want poor people to participate in our work, we need to pay them the wages that they would be earning. If they need to do a 2-day training, we need to ensure that they can get to the training, that it's accessible for them, that it's of interest to them, that it's useful. But we might also need to provide childcare. We might also need to pay them the wages that they would not be getting because they're, you know, coming into our processes. So there's those kinds of things as well. That there's a real structural conversation. So I suppose it's also why we really encourage, you know, people that do have resources to pay dues for the Climate Justice Union. You know, if you can afford $10 a week, put your $10 in so that we can redistribute that in a way that enables other people to take more action. And, you know, we've got one member who pays a high membership who is like, look, I'm working in this other area. I'm getting a good wage. I can't do the work I want to do. Here, take some money so that other people can do the work that needs to be done. So,
and those are equally valuable.
Absolutely.
Because I think it's I think it was Katarina Gator from Climate for Change, a not-for-profit in Melbourne. She said the other day, that, if people don't have time, give money. And if you don't have money, give time. And if you don't have either, benefit from those of us who are making things available that you can just read and look at and work into your lives, whatever way you can. It does seem like, you're practicing what you preach. So that's so good to see, because I think there is an overrun of organisations and movements out there in justice, social equity, environmental sustainability, and sustainability in all its senses that aren't always practicing what they preach. So it's, thanks so much for your time. I'm not going to take up any more of your time, recognizing how valuable your time is. So I'll have to say goodbye now, but thank you so much. And I'll keep my eye on what the Climate Justice Union is up to, because it's really great to see you navigate how you're going to bring together all these things. It's so good to see. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us, Lee, and I'll wait for your membership application.
Just you wait. Bye, everyone. Thanks for watching.